welcome to Canonical. I'm James Shao, and I'm joined by Ied Darris and Sam Spieler.
Hello.
Hey.
Today, we are reviewing the first book in our new series, Apocalypse Soon. Great title, by the way, Sam, which is all about climate or environmental fiction. The first book in our series is Lydia Millet's Children's Bible. If this is your first time joining us, we are also a literary book club on Reddit. You can join our discussion on Reddit by clicking on the link in the episode description. You can also support us in your local bookstore by using our bookshop.org link. At our bookshop store page, you can find the books for our book club and other books that we recommend. That link is also in our episode description. We are also on social media at Canonical Pod. Next week, we will have an in-depth discussion of a children's Bible with spoilers. We hope you'll join us for that episode as well.
I might be inviting a lot of platitudes right now, but I guess the question that I would want to ask, first of all, is why a series on climate fiction? I mean, is there really any need to say anything new about climate change at this point? Is there something new that we can add to the game?
I think there is, and I think we will discover some things today in talking about this book. But in general, I really like apocalyptic stories. And even though we've read some apocalyptic fiction before for this podcast, I haven't read very much in the past couple of years that I really loved, even though that's one of my favorite mini genres. And so I was wanting to find more apocalyptic fiction, but specifically I wanted to find something that is related to climate or environmental fiction. Not only is that a kind of ongoing hot button issue, it's something that I don't see too often in the mainstream of fiction. I see it a lot more in the wings. So I wanted to read some fiction that was new and interesting about climate issues.
Sam, can I ask you another dumb question?
Dumb away.
You mentioned apocalyptic fiction. Do you think that a climate fiction novel that was not apocalyptic could work?
Yeah, I definitely do. I think, James, you talked me down from that. Originally, I was picturing apocalyptic only, and we expanded it to climate fiction because James thought that might be a little more broad, a little more welcoming. But I think that's a more interesting look at things anyway. It doesn't have to be apocalyptic. It's a bit too narrow and too dark, I guess, to just assume that all climate fiction has to be apocalyptic. And so part of this series, I'm hoping, will be to shed some light on other types of that climate or environmental fiction.
I think part of what's interesting about climate fiction is that, and this is something I will, I think, touch on a few times in our discussion this episode and next episode, is that climate fiction is becoming less and less sci-fi because of how climate change is affecting our lives right now, with the number of floods, almost monthly floods that we see around the world, fires that happen all the time in California. It seems like it's a part of our lives and it's less speculative. So I don't think that climate fiction is necessarily apocalyptic. I think there is this kind of opening now for it to be a very realist kind of story because it is going on and it's something that people are grappling with right now. This also, by the way, in my eyes, makes it more literary, or at least it opens up the possibility for more literary works than your generic apocalyptic fiction. Because it's something that is more realist, I think there are more serious writers who otherwise may not be as interested in writing, let's say, apocalyptic sci-fi, but they are interested in writing realist fiction. You know, the climate fiction, I think, gives them a way in.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. I think we've all picked fairly recent books as well. And I did rule out a number of things, at least for myself. I don't know that we ruled each other's things out, but I ruled out a number of things that were just too old, things from like the 60s and 70s that I would like to read, but don't really bring the same kind of meaning today. things that are more dated. And to James's point, they mostly were not realist. They were mostly, high science fiction. Definitely not things that were literary.
Well, let's shift back to this book. You picked this book, Sam. Can you tell us why you picked a children's Bible?
Sure. As I said, I love apocalyptic stories, but the few things that I'd read about this book, little reviews or summaries mostly, I tried hard to avoid anything spoilerish, but what was interesting is that even just digging a little bit, I didn't find too many spoilers. It sounded very different from what I'd usually think of as apocalyptic. And most of the things I read were very vague in their terms about whether this book was actually apocalyptic or what was actually happening in the book. There was something mysterious, and I don't mean mystery genre, but there was some mysterious aspect to all these people talking about this book without getting into any details.
And I see you're doing the same thing now.
I'll get into a little bit more with the summary, but something that has bothered me in the past with climate or environmental fiction, even stuff we've read for this podcast, is that a lot of it gets kind of preachy, and that ends up supplanting the artfulness. And I don't think that's an issue here. I suppose that's up for debate. But while it was something that I was concerned about, almost immediately on starting this, that was dispelled. Lydia Millet has written quite a few novels, more than a dozen novels and short story collections. A lot of it has focused on environmental issues, but there's some political things in there as well. She's won some awards, but she seems to me like one of those authors who's on the cusp of winning big ones. Like, she was a finalist for the Pulitzer for one of her collections. She also writes essays and opinion pieces. And for decades, she's worked as an editor and staff writer for the Center for Biological Diversity, which is a nonprofit focused on awareness and helping to avoid the extinction of different species. So I won't go too deep into what this book is about, because there are a lot of spoilers, and I think we're going to talk quite a bit anyway about the different points. But briefly, a children's Bible is a bunch of different things together. It's about a group of children. Most of them are teenagers. The narrator is a middle teenager named Evie. This group of children is on a forced vacation with their parents at a waterfront mansion. Are they in New York?
I think upstate New York.
Not upstate, because there's no ocean in upstate New York. They've got to be on Long Island.
Oh, yeah, that would make sense. So they're at this mansion when a huge storm with apocalyptic-ish proportions and outcomes comes along, and the kids show themselves to be more capable and responsible than the adults at pretty much every turn in the book. There are loose and obvious parallels to the Bible, and that's about as close as I want to get to spoiler territory. There are quite a lot of spoilers, as I said. Early on, I was worried about the preachy aspect, but that isn't a factor here. The allegory for all the biblical things is really on the nose, and I was worried about how that was going to pan out. But it ends up really working, kind of despite of, and kind of because of that on-the-nose quality. It's kind of like Lydia Millet is saying, here's all this symbolism right on top, because I don't want you to dig for it. I want you to not focus on that. That's not what's important. So if you're focused on the biblical aspect, you're kind of getting sidetracked. The biblical interpretations provide a structure, but not meaning.
Why have the Bible in the book at all?
I think the structure, is important.
I think it gives a really interesting structure, and it gives these touchstones a pretty significant cultural kind of artifact to always come back to. But giving it structure, if you think about the Bible, it's not one cataclysmic event, it's a bunch in a row. By putting this novel in that format, not only do you have a bunch of cataclysmic events shoved into one, it gives a lot of easy analogies for things that could or do happen today.
I think that they're purposefully easy. I think that that's the point, is that it's so obvious.
I wonder if she did this because one of the main demographics in this country, in the US, who do not believe in climate change are the Bible people. And I don't know if she is subverting the Bible, but I think she is, in a way, co opting it. I don't know if this is kind of reaching out to those people or if it's poking fun at those people. But I can't escape the feeling that she's doing it because the Bible people are the people who don't believe in climate change a lot of times. Now, obviously, not every Christian is a science denier, but a lot of them are. So when I was reading this book, I felt like, that's probably why she's doing it. And it's on the nose, as you said, Sam, but it's on the nose for that reason, which, like I'm fairly agnostic about it, pun kind of intended, I guess. If that's the rationale behind it, then I'd be okay with it. I don't love it, but I'd be okay with it.
I think there is some fun having here, but I don't think it's straight out derision. I think you're right that this is an appeal of sorts, but I think it would be cross purposes for her to be completely sacrilegious or joking about the religious aspects.
I think that it's much more sophisticated than that. I don't think that the biblical structure is meant to entice or scorn Christians. I don't think that that's really part of it. I do think that it is important, but what I think it's important for is that it focuses on a theme, which is quite significant. It's really about generational conflict. And I think the reason why the allegory works with that is because it's not clever. It's very obvious, and Millet knows that it's not clever. So instead of expecting us to appreciate how subtle the illusions are and how subtle the allegory is, the acknowledgement of the text is that it's very obvious. And because it's so obvious, it moves the significance of this allegory from the text to metatext. Rather than focusing on the novel itself, it's focusing on how biblical stories are used to relate bigger ideas to other things. And it's showing us that that way of thinking is clumsy. It lets us think about how understanding the present according to the rules of the past is an outdated way of thinking. And to me, at least, that moves the story back to this idea of generational conflict. And that, to me, I think is really masterfully done. And that's really what I loved most about this novel. I think that this is definitely one of the best things that we've read for this podcast.
Some pretty high praise. One of the things I wanted to talk about is the narration. Evie, one of the teenagers, is the narrator. And what's great about having Evie or any teenager as a narrator for this is that the bitterness and the jaded tone of that teenager, it's already there. It comes free and easy. It's baked in. That's what Millet is striving for, is this bitterness that doesn't come with yelling, it comes with scorn.
It doesn't seem out of character for them to dislike their parents, but I would say that it's not just a typical teenage level of distaste. Like, these people really don't like their parents. They have an extra layer of scorn.
Right. It's not like a screw you, mom, I'm going to go hang out at the mall. It's a scorn that is a realization of just how much their parents have fucked things up. In one sense, in a local scale, affecting them personally, but also on a global scale.
This kind of scorn, it's one part of the novel that adds to the tone or the feeling of the novel where you feel like it's not quite real. Like teenagers, I don't think hate their parents for that reason, right? Teenagers do hate their parents, but they don't hate their parents for that reason. I think that's what she does very frequently in this book, is she takes the seed of something that is very real, but she kind of amplifies it to the point where you think, oh, this is a bit strange. It ends up displacing the reader. It makes the reader question, how real is this really?
they're all channeling some serious, like, Greta Thunberg energy. Like, they are seriously angry, and they've definitely politicized it in ways that most teenagers don't. But I really enjoyed that because I think that this is a focus that is not often taken in the climate change conversation, this generational story. And even though, nowadays I'm more closer to the parents' camp than the teens' camp, I still find it immensely gratifying to read this kind of takedown, the scorn in fiction, because I think that there is the sense that people of a certain generation have been given a broken world. They have been given the sum of all of the bad choices that have been made before them. And there is a lot of real anger there that I think should be articulated.
James, you mentioned the real giving way to the unreal, or how did you put it?
I mean, I describe it as kind of almost like a hazy magical realism. Like, it's not magical realist, but it's hazy. You almost feel like in Joyce Carol Oates' stories that something supernatural is about to happen, because this is not exactly how I perceive the world. It's not exactly how we perceive the world, but it's close.
Well, one of the aspects of that is just how capable these kids are. Pretty much everything they do seems in line with that. What I mean is, these are the kinds of kids that will decide they need to start growing vegetables in order to survive. And yet they also still look around for people who are older than them for some kind of leadership. They haven't figured everything out. So a lot of this is them trying to figure out the world in a world where they can't count on anyone else.
Like Iad, I also really did enjoy this book. It felt very fresh. I think that's what you said as well, Iad, that it's kind of tackling this idea of climate fiction differently from how, at least from other books that I've read. I thought that this was done through its tone and voice, and also what I mentioned before, how she has this, knack of amplifying something commonplace. She makes it strange, and I really like that aspect of this book. I think that this novel dresses up as different kinds of fiction, as you mentioned, Sam. It's kind of like a YA novel. It's sci-fi-ish, but not really. It's a biblical allegory. It's kind of magical realism, especially at the end and in certain parts in the middle. But really, for me, it's a work of realist fiction because it's depicting the very real and present danger of climate change. So I think people might lump this in with other sci-fi books like Station 11, which we read in our pandemic literature series. But in my mind, actually, this book is kind of similar to Swamplandia, which was another Sam pick that we read in our postmodern novels of the South series, because of this sort of magical realist aspect of it, where things are just made strange. That's what sticks out to me when reading this book, and it's what I actually really appreciated. I think, though, where this novel differs from Swamplandia, and this is a pretty big difference, is that the characterization in this novel I found to be rather flat, and I might say that this is a weakness, but it's not a very critical weakness. So even Evie, as we mentioned before, the protagonist, she's not very different from the other teens. Like, if you read the story, I don't think the teens are all that different from each other, and I don't think there's anything about Evie that makes her very different from the other teens. As a side note, they played that game at the beginning where they try to make each other guess who their parents are. It's kind of like Millet winking at like how all the parents are very similar to each other, but also the teens are very similar to each other. It doesn't really matter who's parents. Also, I thought it was odd because there's obviously a non-white character there. Like, you'd kind of figure out who that non-white character's parent is, right? Like, isn't he like Mongolian or something?
He's adopted, though, isn't he?
Oh, is he? I must have missed that. Yeah, I was reading that part and I was just like, oh yeah, this writer's white. Like, of course, these are all white characters, and they're like, oh, we all look the same. So, I mean, that's not really a critique, but when I was reading, I was like, okay, everyone looks the same.
I think that is part of the point. I think she could have made them different, but I don't think they're meant to be.
I agree. I'm just sort of poking fun at the fact that this is something like a white writer would do in a book full of white characters. Like everyone looks the same, you can't tell them apart. Would I be able to do that in a story featuring characters that I know well in San Francisco? Probably not, you know. Obvious joke being like all Chinese people look the same. So I think for me, the only character that really stands out that seems kind of fleshed out is Jack. And I said that, all these characters being flat, it could be conceived as a weakness, but I think you could also say that this is the point of the novel. Like this book isn't the story of a person or about individual agency, but rather it's a story about people, like groups of people in society, and it's about how natural forces like climate change will strip people away of any supposed control they might think they have over their own life. So, even though I said it was a weakness, I think it's justified in the book.
I think the reason Jack stands out, I don't think we should talk too much about it because there are spoilers surrounding Jack, but I think that's very much on purpose. I think he provides a pretty important role in the book and in the allegory, but we will definitely talk about that next episode.
So, like you, James, I think the comparison to Karen Russell's Swamplandia is pretty good. The reason why I think they're comparable is not really because of genre, but because of the intelligence displayed by both writers in the novel. And I think that that intelligence is able to come through because the tone of these two novels is so ironic in a sense. It's not sanctimonious. It balances the seriousness of its topic with the intelligence of its writer. And Millet definitely is an intelligent writer. She is smart enough to realize that she can have it all. She can be smart and incisive about climate change without being sanctimonious or smug. It's not necessarily ironic or sincere. It acknowledges the humor in the situations the characters are in by also acknowledging the tropiness of the usual way that these things are depicted in fiction. So, one thing that I think the listener should definitely know is that this is a serious novel, but it's also a very funny novel. And that humor, I think, is very important to the success of the novel.
She's able to avoid being preachy while still having some kind of heft to what's going on. It's funny, but I wouldn't call it light. It's allegorical and literary, but it's not so deep in that it's hard to read. It's a very easy read.
It's one of my fastest reads. Like the sentences are really easy. The thinking you do with this book, I don't think they happen as you read it. I think after you finish the book, then you start thinking about it. Like while you're in the process of reading, the plot is quite engaging, so you just kind of speed along, or at least that's what I did. It's kind of written in the style of I don't even know if it's young adult, like it's younger than that. It's a little bit like Harry Potter or Narnia. Like it's got that kind of sentence structure where it seems like it's geared toward kids, at least at the start.
So, speaking of books we've read before, for our Obsession series, we read a book by Thomas Bernhard, who Millet has mentioned is one of her favorite writers. I can kind of understand that in terms of tone, but their approach and style are so different. Do you see any hints of that influence here?
I think it's an intellectual rather than artistic influence. I think that what they share is a similar type of misanthropy, but also a similar type of honesty. They want to understand humanity on the deepest level possible. So whenever they find something unpleasant, they don't look away. Like they try to focus on the unpleasantness, and then whatever beauty or grace remains, they can know is pure. That's the way I felt about this novel, at least, because the parents and the way the parents are shown is so unflattering that if they are to be redeemed at all, it's really after kind of a trial by fire.
Yeah, I can see that. Although I will say that as this mirrors a lot of things in the Bible, and the Bible is very dark in places, She has all the chances in the world to go full dark, but she almost always pulls back a bit because this isn't that kind of book.
Yes, I think it's just the way you read a book and it shows you the way that somebody might think about the world. It's not actually what's on the page, but what you imagine Millet is like and what you imagine Bernhard is like.
I feel like more writers should do this, where like when they get interviewed, they just name some totally random person that they happen to kind of like. I'm just thinking like just name your famous writer, and they're like, oh yeah, I just really like Dr. Seuss. Just huge influence on my work. All right, let's take a break. When we come back, we'll talk about who we would recommend this book to.
If you're interested in Lydia Millet's A Children's Bible, you might also want to check out The Emissary by Yoko Tawada, which we discussed in one of our earliest episodes in our Japanese fiction series. We also mentioned Galapagos by Kurt Vonnegut from our Transhumanist series. And finally, you might also be interested in Parable of the Sower by Octavia Butler, which we reviewed in our recent Afrofuturism series. It covers similar cataclysmic themes. And of course, stay tuned for the rest of the series for more climate fiction.
Okay, welcome back. So, who would you recommend this book to? Let's start with you, Iad, since you seem to really like this book. And you also seem to be the most hard-hearted critic among us.
To quote a great man, I would recommend this book to everyone. This is the kind of book where I'm surprised that people don't talk about Lydia Millet all the time. Because this book is so good, and it's not good in a Thomas Bernhard sort of way where it's really challenging, or good in a Sebald sort of way where it's really obscure and difficult to relate to. Like, this is really easy to read, really intellectually satisfying. It's just got everything that a reader should want. And if people are willing to listen, I would definitely tell them to read this book.
Yeah, I would recommend it to everyone. I think it's very accessible. And I wonder, this is the question I seem to ask every review, which is, what about those Bible people? The people who are not us. I feel like they would enjoy it too. I feel like, as we talked about before, she's not poking fun at the Bible, so I don't think they would feel like they're being talked down to. But it's not really using the Bible in the way that evangelicals use the Bible. So I do wonder, like, this is a question I have. If I could interview a well-spoken intellectual evangelical, what would they think about this book? Because I'm legitimately curious.
I am too, but I don't actually think I would recommend it to everyone. I would recommend it to most people.
What?
But I think they have to have a literary bent.
Really? Because this is very much a thriller for me.
It's very accessible, as we've discussed. I think you can read it without seeing behind the curtain, so to speak. I think you can read it without looking too deep at what is really going on. You bring up the super religious evangelical Christian readers. There are going to be people among those that can read this and be happy with it and be not just entertained, but can look at it critically and I guess the use of the Bible critically. But I actually do wonder and worry that there are going to be people that are going to take offense at this, which would be ridiculous. I think everything we've said today is correct, that this is not poking fun. But I know there are going to be people who will think that it is.
Wait, who are these people, though? Even though it is obviously about climate change, who are these people who would be offended? Like, if you read this book and you're an unthinking person, because if you're a climate change denier, then you're an unthinking person. They're not going to read into any subtext. They're just going to read a book about these kids trying to survive a disaster with, like, later in the book, there are guns and stuff and things get shot.
I get, but it's called a children's Bible. I mean, like we said, it is on the nose. It is not hiding that.
Yeah, but I mean, well, that's my question is, like, would people who are really religious be offended? I don't think there's anything offensive here.
I think if you think about it carefully, yes.
I think the things that we're going to talk about next episode, I think there are things that could offend people, possibly. And I've known enough, let's say, non-denominational Christians to know that there are people that get offended at really bizarre things.
I think that the novel is an intellectual challenge, but it's not a slap in the face. And it depends how you feel about an intellectual challenge. Some people don't like even to be challenged.
You mentioned that this is a thriller, and I agree, but I do feel like there are people in my life, at least, that I wouldn't recommend this to, not because of anything that's wrong with this book, but I don't know if it's enough for them. Even though it's not a difficult book by any means, I don't know if it really will appeal to everyone.
I'm honestly I'm flabbergasted
I knew you would be, but
because I feel like, there are books that we've read that are more activist that would obviously offend people, but you would like recommend. But this book, for me, I think if you are not someone who is into close reading, if you don't want to think about a book, you just want to read for fun, you can do that with this book. Like you can't do that with, let's say, I don't know, The Death of Vivek Oji, which we read, like a month or so ago. I think with that book, if you're someone who just wants a surface level read and you're offended by trans people, like you would not like that book.
what I guess I'm getting at, though, is that while there are a lot of things happening in this book, this is not a spy novel, where the good guy wins and there's gunshots at every corner. This is not action packed. There's a lot of things happening, but it's not that kind of book. It is not going to hold the attention of everyone.
I see what you mean. If you strip away the literary significance, the genre content that remains is not enough to satisfy a real genre fan.
Exactly.
Yeah, I guess so. I mean, I'm a real genre fan.
Yeah, but you're also a literary fan.
Well, no, but I read it almost all the way through. I thought it was pretty
Oh, very
captivating.
good. Congrats.
No, I mean, I just mean like, I think it's very captivating. I feel like it is one of the more captivating books of the books that we've read. It's on par for me with Parable of the Sower, which I thought was also very, well plotted and plot driven. This book felt very well plotted. I will say though that even though I said it was accessible, there are a lot of things to like about this book. I don't think I'm as in love with this book as you are, Ed, in that I don't think it makes my top five, for example, even though I really did like this book. It's missing a few things for me. Like these are just personal likes. Like I like language, and I think the language here is like okay. As you know, I'm the Colson Whitehead fanboy. Even though his novels are maybe more flawed than this book, I would totally read a Coulson novel over this book just because of the language. So for me personally, like I think it's, it's good, very good even, but there's nothing here that really, really excites me.
I agree, although reading this did make me really want to check out her short fiction.
I would like to read more from her.
I actually finished another one of her novels, waiting for you guys to be ready to record this podcast. So I'm already on my way. If you like this one, I can say that definitely you should check out the rest of her fiction because she has similar strengths. I think that this is not an outlier in terms of her voice and in terms of her talent.
Before we conclude, then, Yed, what is the other book you read? And is it also related to climate concerns or climate change?
Just to pull back a little bit, this is something that we'll talk about much more next week. I don't think that climate change is really the linchpin of her thought. I think that the main thing that she focuses on is a type of anti-humanism and a type of anti-anthropocentrism. The other book that I read is called How the Dead Dream, and I think what it shares with this novel and what it shares with her thought that I've seen in her interviews is a resistance towards a certain sort of selfishness or self interest to the exclusion of the rest of creation and the rest of the world. That to me, I think, is the biggest thing that she's concerned with. And it manifests in this novel in terms of climate change, but it's not exclusively climate change.
All right, well, sounds like we have a lot to talk about next episode. Thank you for listening. If you thought we were off base with our review of this book, we'd love for you to let us know on Reddit. You can find that link below. We are also on social media at Canonical Pod. If you enjoyed this podcast, please give us a review on Apple or your podcast platform of choice. We'll be back next week with an in-depth discussion of a children's Bible. If you'd like to join our discussion, go ahead and find a copy of this book. It is a fast read. Till next time, happy reading. We'll talk to you soon.